Hello, welcome to Sunday School with Camden, Arkansas's First United Methodist Church. I'm Ellen Horseman. I am finishing the last lesson in a book on the Psalms in the Immersion Bible Studies. The book was written by Professor J. Clinton McCann, Jr. And the last chapter he entitles Establishing Justice. Now, justice is something we talk about in this country and I guess everywhere quite a bit, and it's frequently mentioned in the Bible. But what is justice? I think most of the time when we hear the word justice, we think about it as somebody did something wrong and justice means that they get punished for it. But punishment is not at all what justice refers to in the Psalms or in the Bible as a whole. The concept of justice definitely plays out in the Psalms, and it's a key psalm in what are called the Enthronement Psalms or the Royal Psalms. So what are those? The Enthronement Psalms are those psalms that either call God King, specifically call God King, or at least they proclaim that God reigns, like a king would do. And royal psalms deal with an earthly king. And so those are what the two psalms are. But let's get started. Let's get started talking about justice. And even though I just introduced enthronement psalms and royal psalms, I realized, oh wait, I'm going to start with a psalm. I hope I marked it properly. I did. That's not really one of those two kind of psalms, but which does a good job mentioning what is the proper criteria for God and for God as king. And then of course later on it will also apply to kings. Well, okay, let's take a look at this. It's a very short psalm. It's only 8 verses long, and it's really unusual because it's set as if, well, in an imaginary setting. I'm sure that it's supposed to be a metaphor, not something taken literally. The writer starts off saying, God stands in the divine council. He gives judgment among the gods. And of course we know that there aren't a lot of gods, although the Canaanites would have seen that there were many gods and often would have had a council of gods meeting. But I think the idea is that God, here Yahweh, God, is greater than all these other gods. He takes his stand among them and he judges these gods. They're found lacking. And why are they lacking? It's because, as verses 3 and 4 say, let me find it here. He says to these gods, how long will you judge unjustly by granting favor to the wicked? Give justice to the lowly and the orphan. Maintain the right of the poor and the destitute. Deliver them from the power of the wicked. So it's the failure of these would-be gods to bring justice that actually goes on in the psalm. It says it causes the earth's foundations to shake. And so God, Yahweh, strips all these other gods of their power and says, you will die like mortals, you will fall down like any prince. Now again, this is highly symbolic or metaphorical. We're not meant to literally believe there's a bunch of gods. We could certainly look at our own lives and ask ourselves what gods we have. But the point here is that these other powers that are competing with God, the reason they're brought to task is because they are not judging justly. They are, and God calls them that we need to give justice to the lowly and the orphan. So clearly justice is important in this very short psalm of 8 verses. Justice is mentioned 4 times, and it is the quality that those gods lack. Justice, it's clear from this psalm, means caring for the lowly and the orphan, maintaining the rights of the poor, rescuing the needy from oppression. That's not punishment, is it? It has more to do with caring and loving and taking care of the weak and the vulnerable. And the enthronement psalms highlight this quality of justice. Remember, I said that the enthronement psalms are those in which the poet directly calls God king, or he affirms that Yahweh reigns. In other words, he lets us know that God, Yahweh, is king. And these enthronement psalms are Psalm 93 and Psalms 95 through 99. So I'm going to look at one of these, which is Psalm 98. I think it's pretty typical of these enthronement psalms. They call for praise for God because God is king. And so let me read 98 because it's really short. And while you're listening to it, listen to how the poet here calls for, first of all, all the people, and then all the people of the earth and this everything to praise God, and then tells us why. Well, all right, Ellen, so let's read it here. Sing to the Lord a new song, because he has done wonderful things. His own strong hand and his own holy arm have won the victory. The Lord has made his salvation widely known. He has revealed his righteousness in the eyes of all the nations. God has remembered his loyal love and faithfulness to the house of Israel. Every corner of the earth has seen our God's salvation. Shout triumphantly to the Lord, all the earth. Be happy, rejoice out loud, sing your praises. Sing your praises to the Lord with the lyre and the sound of music, with trumpets and a horn blast. Shout triumphantly before the Lord the King. Let the sea and everything in it roar, the world and all its inhabitants too. Let all the rivers clap their hands. Let the mountains rejoice out loud all together before the Lord. And I'm going to stop right before the end of this. You hear how everything is proclaiming the wonder of God and shouting with joy. And now the writer is going to tell why. Because he is coming to establish justice on the earth. He will establish justice in the world rightly. He will establish justice among all people fairly. God comes to establish justice. That's why we are praising God. That's why God is our King. He has come to establish justice fairly among the people. And we've already seen that justice means taking care of the poor and the vulnerable. So this whole concept of justice is an extremely important one in the book of Psalms, as it is throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. God desires justice. God desires justice. God gives justice, as we see in this enthronement psalm I just read you. And God desires that we humans also help God in establishing justice. Now, of course, chief among those would be the kings themselves, and that's how the royal psalms fit in. The royal psalms would describe what a king should be like, hoping, of course, that the king would live up to those elements, and justice is one of the key phrases that's used in all those royal psalms that I mentioned a moment ago. Did I mention? I think I did. Okay, so let's look at one example of a royal psalm. It's Psalm 72. I'm reading this, or looking at it, out of the NRSV. Certainly this psalm, just like we heard that other psalm, just proclaiming God's greatness and telling everyone that they should praise God, this proclaims the king, the earthly king. It sounds a lot like a prayer, maybe a prayer that was said as a king was being enthroned, a prayer for the king. I mean, it starts off begging God to give the king justice. It praises God and calls for God to take care of this newly enthroned king with wonderful lines like this. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to jump around in it, as you may figure out if I just keep going. But listen to some of the ways that the king is prayed for. Well, that's not it. Ellen, where'd you go? Oh, may he live, sorry, this is verse 5, I guess it is. May he live while the sun endures, as long as the moon, throughout all generations. May he be like rain that falls on the mown grass, like showers that water the earth. In his days may righteousness flourish and peace abound until the moon is no more. So you have these beautiful images of and prayer for the king, that he's gonna live as long as the sun endures, and that showers will water the earth, and righteousness and peace will flourish in his days. Okay, so that's some pretty great things, but what are the most desirables of a successful king? It's contained in this Psalm 72. And well, let's start back. I'm going to go backwards now to where this poem begins. Listen to how it begins. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the king's son. Righteousness, as we've said in previous lessons, because listen, it asks you to give your king justice, give your king righteousness. Well, we've already talked about righteousness in some previous lessons dealing with the Psalms, but righteousness basically means living in a right relationship with God. It is making God the center of our life. The righteous person is the one who recognizes his need for God, who rejoices in God's love, and who desires to return the love that God has given by loving God and loving God's children. So the prayer here is that the king will have that righteousness, but also that the king will have your justice. That's the other desirable quality that's mentioned here in Psalm 72. Justice. And if that justice is so desirable, well, what does it look like? Now my verse 2. Here's part of what justice looks like. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. Did you hear that? The poor will be judged with justice. And again in verse 4, may he defend the cause of the poor of the people. Give deliverance to the needy and crush the oppressor. So you see what's happening here? What it is that is justice? That the king will take care of the poor, defending their cause, giving them deliverance, and crushing those who oppress the poor or the vulnerable. And the psalm will go on praying for the king's power and rule, even to the point where the writer asked that all of the kings bow down to the king of Israel. May the kings of Tarshish and the isles render him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring him gifts. May all kings fall down before him and all nations give him service. But why? Why? What is the reason that all people should praise this king? What is the true source of this king's power? Here's the answer that follows immediately, because he says, may all kings fall down before him, all nations give him service. And here's the why. For he delivers the needy when they call, the poor and those who have no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy, and saves the lives of the needy from oppression and violence. He redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight. That is what justice looks like. That is what makes this king great. He delivers the needy when they call. He has pity on the weak and the needy, and he redeems their life from oppression and violence. That was hard to say. And then it's not just a question that he takes care of the needy, I guess I should say, that he saves the poor and the vulnerable from oppression and violence. But justice also means loving those oppressed and weak and needy and poor people. Listen to how it's put here. How do we know that the king loves them? And precious is their blood in his sight. Oh, that we would have a heart like that, so that the blood, or in other words, the lives, because the blood meant lives, that the life of the poor would be precious in our sight. That is what justice looks like. Well, obviously, Israel's kings often failed in that. They didn't always take care of the oppressed, of the poor, of the weak. They didn't always hold up the poor and the needy and the oppressed and say, your lives are precious to me. I want to take care of you. And you know what? They're not the only ones that fail at that. We fail at that all the time too. Obviously, they failed to live out God's vision of justice, and we failed too, but we are still responsible. Psalm 149 calls achieving justice an honor for all God's people. So if we've seen in these Psalms that in the Enthronement Psalm that God is the embodiment of justice, this caring for the weak and the needy and the oppressed, if we've seen in some of these royal Psalms, like we did here with the king, that the king is to be the embodiment of God's justice, that the king is to care for those who are vulnerable, we see in that Psalm 149 that justice is an honor for all God's people, or as the Wesley Bible Study puts it or comments, the community understands itself to be the embodiment of God's justice. The community, of course, when the psalm was being written, was the people of Israel, the people of Judah. But the community now is we Christians. So can we, like the community here, understand ourselves to be the embodiment of God's justice? Do we see ourselves as the embodiment of God's justice? Do we understand that God's justice means having a heart for the poor and the oppressed and actively working to help them? Not just feeling kindly towards the poor or non-judgmental towards the poor, but working to feed them and clothe them and care for them, standing up for them, demanding that our leaders in the church, our leaders in our community, and our leaders in our nation take care of the poor and vulnerable. Do we actively work for God's justice? Which means, do we actively work for the poor and the oppressed, no matter why they are poor or weak or vulnerable? In other words, do we help them without condemning them? Do we understand, as Reverend McCann puts it, that God's justice is more about giving people what they need rather than what they deserve? I'm going to say it again because I liked what he said. God's justice is more about giving people what they need rather than what they deserve. And Jesus makes this vision of justice clear. In Matthew 25, when he talks about when the human one returns, here's the criterion that he put forward for judging. When he calls the righteous in to their wonderful days ahead, he says, for I was hungry and you gave me food to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothes to wear. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. And of course, you know from that story that the righteous say, well, when did we do this? When did we see you hungry, etc.? In other words, when did we do all these things for you? And of course, Jesus the King answers them, I assure you that when you have done it for one of the least of my brothers and sisters, you have done it for me. My friends, may we develop a heart for the poor, so that like that king in Psalm 22, we can say, precious is their blood, precious is their life in our sight. And may we actively work to bring about God's justice with our love and care and activism on the part of the vulnerable and the weak and the poor. That's what God calls us to, and what a glorious, glorious commission he has given us. my friends, sorry, may God richly bless you all. Thank you, and bye-bye.